Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. So today I wanted to talk to you guys about building and managing distributed teams. As I'm speaking, feel free to come up with questions on Slido. I'd be happy to answer them after. So first of all, let me actually start by defining what exactly is a distributed team. So at least one definition of a distributed team is basically groups of geographically, organizationally, and/or time-dispersed workers that are brought together by information and telecommunication technologies so that they can accomplish some organizational task. So one common question that actually comes up is that people use the word remote and distributed fairly synonymously. However, let me just clarify what the distinction actually is. If you have the majority of your organization in one location and you have scattered offices, then you have a distributed team. If at the end of the day the majority is in headquarters and then the rest of the team is scattered, then you have a remote team. So one interesting thing to keep in mind is that Upwork did a study in late 2017 of about 1,000 hiring managers, and they asked them kind of, how do you feel about hiring over the next several years? And more than half of them basically said that they expect distributed teams to increase as part of their overall company strategy. And at the end of the day, it's something like 38% of the respondents basically said that over the next 10 years, they expect to be managing a lot more distributed teams. And so there's a natural question of why. So this chart is actually, you guys are not seeing what I'm seeing. So this chart is actually somewhat in dispute. And it's because the data is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I believe these extrapolations were done back in 2010, so they're a little bit less accurate now. However, if you look at the data, the fact still remains that there's far more computer science demand than there are graduates that are getting computer science degrees. And so that basically leads to a situation where are we going to get all these graduates if we're trying to grow our teams, if we're trying to get more people in STEM and computer science? So the answer is we have to look worldwide. And looking at this graph, it's going to be interesting to note that China has 4 times the US population, but has 9 times the number of STEM graduates. And looking down the list, you can actually see that in China and India and the US and other places like Russia, Iran, Indonesia, Japan, is generating a lot of computer science graduates, which means that there's a large pool of talent outside the US itself. You can actually see that North America is not dark green. It's not at the top of the list. And that little country in the lower right-hand corner, continent Australia, actually is doing better than the US. And if we zoom in on this data a little bit, you can actually see the data firsthand in terms of the countries if we go down the list of, at least according to HackerRank, or people that take the HackerRank challenges, what their perspective is on the quality of candidates across different countries. So if you're going to be building a distributed team, one of the major considerations is obviously what location are you going to do it in. So if we take a look at this, you can actually see that over the past few years, the amount of talent in Germany has actually surpassed the amount of talent in UK. And actually, the number of engineers across all of Germany now kind of overtakes the number of engineers in the UK. And you can see that there's a lot of talent across Eastern, Western Europe, and Asia. And then lastly, here's kind of a breakdown of the major cities in a lot of the countries that we just showed, and how the talent and the amount of talent that stacks up. And you can kind of see the main players: London, Paris, Moscow, Madrid, and Berlin, and up there. But there's also plenty of talent in Stockholm, in Vienna, and Bucharest. So you can basically go worldwide. And so then the question becomes, how do I make a decision in terms of going into this particular country or that particular country? And we'll get to that in a minute. So another obvious consideration if you're going to be building a distributed team is cost. Am I going to kind of have to spend more money, or am I actually going to save money by going within the country or going outside of the country? So let's actually start within the US. I know some of you guys are looking at this going, holy crap, that's what people make in San Francisco. Well, not everybody is here at the FESC conference, but this is just base salary, but it gives you a pretty good idea of the distribution of salaries across the US. In other words, if you ended up building a distributed team in Austin, for example, you'd probably save close to 20% in terms of engineering costs. And if you ended up building a distributed team in Houston, you'd save probably closer to 30%. So it's a pretty big variance. And if you're a company that's trying to grow and is trying to acquire a lot of engineering talent, and you're trying to figure out where am I going to go? Do I want to go within the US? Do I want to go outside of US? These are kind of pretty interesting numbers to have in hand. However, the data becomes a lot more stark and interesting if you actually look worldwide, because then if you compare the US to other countries on this particular list, you can see that the discrepancy becomes much, much, much bigger, right? If you go to France, for example, you're probably saving more than half in terms of engineering costs, which means you could potentially hire twice as many engineers. And if we go back to the data that we saw previously based on HackerRank challenges, you're not necessarily getting any worse talent. It's just cheaper. So then the question becomes, how do we actually, if we're going to build a distributed team, what are the most critical factors? At least from my experience, having the right lead is one of the most beneficial things that you can do for building a successful distributed team. And so you want to try to seed a distributed team with ideally a transplant from headquarters. Why? Because if you're seeding somebody who's a transplant, they already have a good understanding of the established company culture. They have a good understanding of the clear vision and the clear mission, which we'll get to in a minute. And they're already knowledgeable and trustworthy. So you can plant that seed, and then you can watch it grow over time. But another option is you can basically just hire somebody who has experience building distributed teams from whatever location it is that you want to expand into. And then once you hire that person, you make them responsible for the interviewing, the hiring, and the growing of the team itself. It's pretty tricky to find somebody externally if you're not going to be doing a transplant. But that's where if you end up having the right interview process, if you have the right criteria in mind, and you're looking for somebody that has done it before, or somebody that's really passionate about growing teams and being successful as a distributed or a remote team, those people are definitely out there, and they're also passionate about basically being an extension of a great company. So now let's assume that you've established a remote or distributed team. How do we make them successful? What are some of the key challenges? One of the biggest issues that I've seen every time I've ever worked with any distributed team is this them versus us perspective. And it just depends on where you happen to be sitting, whether you're them or you're us, or when you travel, it's inverted. But every single time there's this question of, well, if they're distributed and then we just looked at the salary data and they're in another location and they're making half as much money as I am, that means that they must be an inferior team. Well, the answer is no, because I just showed you guys the data that location is independent of talent to a large extent. But it's a major issue that comes up every single time, and it's very important to be honest and transparent and to address it head on. And it's also a major violation of trust for a distributed team if people assume that they're somehow not as good or not as knowledgeable as the team in home base. So one of the other obvious differences with distributed team is cultural, right? If you're going to be building a team in a different country, you have to have some understanding of the differentiators between your own culture and the culture of the country that you're building a team in. And one thing to keep in mind there is, for example, Europe has a very different set of laws than Asia, which also has a very different set of laws from the US. And people's work ethic varies very significantly across different geographies and different countries. So as an example, we have a distributed team in Israel, and Israel has a Sunday through Thursday work week. So we adjusted our development practices as well as our launch practices so that we can be mindful of the fact that there's people that are working on Sunday but not working on Friday. And that's been very good for both teams, and it also shows respect and collaboration. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about, and I alluded to this earlier, is that if you're going to have a successful distributed team, you want to have a clear mission and a clear vision. So a vision is basically something that you want the organization to become. And an example of that would be something like being at least for Houzz, being the best place for home design, right? That's kind of an aspirational statement that you can get everybody within the company to rally around. And then a mission is something that you want to concretely accomplish. And that's something that's going to be specific to whatever distributed team you establish. But the more clear the mission for the distributed team and the more clear the goals for that distributed team, the more likely that they'll actually be able to accomplish them. And finally, if you're going to be having a distributed team, you need to be able to communicate, and you need to be able to communicate effectively. Transparency is probably one of the most important things you can do with any remote or distributed team. treat distributed teams as if they were local. Overshare information as much as possible. Keep everybody included. And so if you're holding company-wide meetings, whether it's weekly or bi-weekly, make sure that you're doing it at a time when distributed teams can dial in so that they feel that they're part of the overall, strategy and they're getting information at the same time as everybody else. And of course, try to use messaging apps like Slack or workspaces or any kind of mechanisms where everybody sees information at the same time so that everybody can basically participate. And finally, if you're going to be having remote or distributed teams, you want to be as collaborative as possible. And collaboration is essentially based on trust. These are kind of some of the main principles as part of being a trustworthy culture. And so you want to make sure that the distributed team is somebody that has integrity, sincerity, reliability, they're competent. But at the end of the day, if they have those qualities, you have to trust them, right? You gave them a mission, you gave them goals, and then you have to trust them to execute on those goals. But as the saying goes, trust but verify, and your goals are the mechanism by which you can verify them, right? You don't have to stand over them, you don't have to micromanage them. You can just look, are the goals being accomplished? And if the answer is yes, then give them more goals and give them a broader mission. And everybody is going to benefit as a result. So finally, community. As I mentioned, you want to make the remote teams feel local, which basically means try to travel. Try to get them to travel as often as possible. Obviously, cost is a consideration, so that's something that needs to be worked out. But certainly treat the remote teams as local. Create a sense of shared values. And I think if you follow these basic principles, we've had a number of distributed teams that have worked very successfully for us. And so these are kind of learnings that I've had over time working with a number of different distributed teams. I hope that if you apply them, they'll work well for you as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jerry. Now we have some time for Q&A. So if you haven't already, upvote. In the meantime, I'm going to take the first one off the list. What do you think about teams that have members geographically distributed versus the entire team in a different geography?
So this is actually a pretty interesting question, and there's, I would say, a lot of research material on whether this works really well or not. I think at the end of the day, it comes down to people and who the lead is. And kind of those are both things that I've already mentioned. If you have the right leadership structure in place, whether that leadership structure is local or remote, they're going to be able to work well to accomplish the goals. So I don't necessarily think that, for example, having an entire team in a different geography is a problem, unless they're working on a project that requires a tremendous amount of collaboration with home base or with other teams. If they have, the more independent that they can be, the clearer their goal and the clearer their mission, the more successful they're going to be at the end of the day. And that holds true for both cases, whether you have members geographically distributed or you have entire teams that are geographically distributed.
Thank you. Next one is, how do you gauge motivation and engagement of your distributed team?
So that's a great question, and I think the answer to this one is pretty simple. I talk to them. So I'm a big proponent of video conferencing and trying to do as much face-to-face as possible. And so when I talk to distributed teams, one, I try to visit them. And it's a very different feeling when you're living and breathing the same space as the distributed team than when you're dialing in from headquarters. They perceive it as being very different, and you yourself will also perceive it as very different. So I try to travel to distributed offices at least as often as I can or as often as budget or whatnot permits. And then I talk to the people there and I ask them, what's your impression? What is working? What is not working? What could we do more? What could we do less of? How do we make your life kind of feel more integrated? And then I try to address those things.
Sure. All right, what are some best practices for defining boundaries, interfaces between teams?
So this is a great question, and I would say it's probably the second most important issue next to the kind of them versus us problem that I've seen with all distributed teams. But it's also just as applicable with teams within headquarters that have different responsibilities. My personal perspective is the more that you can clearly define the boundary. So for example, we have a distributed team that works on a lot of our mobile apps, and we have a very clean API in between our mobile apps and our backends. So that makes it very easy as a communication mechanism where we can define, or product managers can define, along with designers, what it is that we want to build, and then we can build mobile apps for those. And then there's an API that the backend team in headquarters will develop, and then the mobile teams will then use that API. I think that's kind of one example. Another is organizational, which is we have one distributed team that basically has a carve-out of our marketplace business. So just like within headquarters, if you have different business units that are managed by different teams, then I try to identify business units that have kind of one, something that's important and something that's meaty that teams can accomplish, and two, something that's relatively independent. In fact, as independent as possible. I've gone in so far as having to rewrite systems completely to tease apart remote teams or distributed teams from some of the dependencies that they have in home base, just to give them the freedom to innovate and to move much faster without having those dependencies. Sometimes it's just hard. You may not be able to do that based on your own constraints or based on your own architecture.
All right, we have one last question, and it is, what is your view on business class travel?
Oh, this one's very simple. I don't do it. Okay.
All right, well then that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's round of applause for Jerry.